Even things where women were never a majority, like military participants. There have always been women who have fought in conflicts and battles and wars and picked up arms. They've never been the majority, but they've always been present in these conflicts. And there have always been a certain amount of women who have fought in these engagements, just like men.
Welcome to Whispers of the Past. I'm your host, Fie de Wit, and this is Revolts and the Promise of Sovereignty. In this episode, we step into the period of 1800 to 1850, a time of growing defiance when resistance against colonial rule surged across the Caribbean. Even as European powers debated abolition, the enslaved refused to wait for their freedom to be granted. Revolts ignited across the region, fueled by whispers of emancipation and the unyielding determination of those still in bondage. But what does it truly mean to resist? Is rebellion only measured by weapons and warfare? Or does it also exist in the quiet acts of defiance that shape history from the shadows? For too long, women's roles in uprising have been overlooked. Yet, they were not just witnesses to history. They were strategists, advisors, and bearers of knowledge that sustained entire movements. To begin, historian Dr. Anishanslin takes us beyond St. Eustatius, offering a broader perspective on the Atlantic world. She reveals how women's resistance, though often unseen, was fundamental to the revolutions that reshaped the Caribbean.
Yes, so some people, I think, assume that men are always the ones who are leading revolts because they tend to be the warriors in revolutions and rebellions. But in pretty much every war, women are present as active fighters as well, whether that's by choice or by accident. And so you do have examples of women actually fighting in rebellions in the 18th and 19th century. But I think more importantly, women are present in ways that support the revolution and rebellion in various places in the Atlantic world, as people who are spiritual advisors, practical advisors, people who are the keepers of memory in terms of what's happening and things in the past that might inform the present and their actions. They're also the people who often have their ears to the ground. They can easily collect the latest gossip and the latest news, particularly enslaved women who are laboring inside plantation houses, who are close to their enslavers for various reasons, and sometimes that is because of a sexual relationship. They're conduits of information. And so they can be really important central actors in these sort of networks of communication that Julia Scott and other historians have identified as really important in flaming the fans of rebellion in the Caribbean in the 18th and 19th centuries.
Women's role in rebellion have often been overshadowed by male-dominated narratives. But as Dr. Anishanslin explains, their contributions extended far beyond combat, encompassing intelligence gathering, spiritual leadership, and direct resistance. What does it truly mean to lead a rebellion? Is it defined solely by those who wield weapons? Or does leadership also lie in the unseen network that sustain revolts from within? In a world where survival often depends on strategy, enslaved women, especially those laboring inside plantation houses, became critical sources of intelligence. Their proximity to enslavers granted them access to whispered plans, shifting political currents, and the hidden tension that could spark an uprising. These women became conduits of knowledge. Their voices carried vital information through secret networks that historians recognize as essential to the Caribbean resistance movements. But this knowledge came at a cost. For these women, information was both a weapon and a burden, a tool for liberation, yet a risk that could mean a difference between freedom and a deadly punishment. Beyond gathering intelligence, enslaved women also played vital roles as spiritual guides and advisors, drawing upon traditions deeply rooted in West African heritage. These traditions, passed down through generations, offered strength and strategy in time of turmoil. But how did these roles translate into leadership during uprisings? How did the wisdom of women shape the course of the rebellion? Dr. Anishanslin explains.
And I think also among communities where African spiritual traditions are still present and African cultural traditions are really strong, female leaders in Africa do have, again, a different role than they do in white patriarchal European societies. And so, there's a sense that women should be respected as the keepers of collective memory, and the idea that women can be wise and offer counsel to the men who are going to fight and be warriors, and also that there are female spiritual leaders in a lot of West African traditions. And so I think you see all of these various roles of women coming together. But of course, as with what defines their conditions of enslavement, it also can be difficult for women these times of rebellion and revolution, because it's harder for you to run with an army or, run to a maroon community if you have a baby, that you're a baby in your arms, that you're breastfeeding, right? And so I think these are, again, concerns that aren't limited to women. Certainly, men are fathers and have familial concerns too, but it was definitely the case in this period that women are the primary caregivers and nurturers usually of children. And so this is going to affect their ability to be physically present with revolutionary armies and forces. But again, any army or military force, and this is true across time in the Caribbean as elsewhere, relies on the labor of women to sustain it. So you have women working as cooks and laundresses and sexual partners and doing all the things that keep an army full of men on their feet and in fighting condition. And so you see this again with women involved in slave revolts and rebellions throughout the Caribbean. So I would say they do play a really vital role in multiple ways, even though they're not obviously, the ones primarily yielding the swords or the bayonets or the musket.
As Dr. Anishanslin highlights, women were woven into the very fabric of resistance, whether through spiritual leadership, intelligence gathering, or sustaining revolutionary forces. They were indispensable. Yet, while these networks of resistance stretched across the Caribbean, each island has its own story to tell. How did these broader movements toward freedom shape life on Sint Eustatius? To understand the local impact, we turn to Mrs. Soutekouw, a long-term resident and one of the founders of the Center of Archaeology and Research. She helps us explore the period of unrest here on Sint Eustatius and how enslaved individuals sought their own path to freedom, often looking beyond their own shores to islands where slavery had already been abolished.
This was a time of slavery unrest all through the Caribbean. In 1846, the English islands granted emancipation of slavery. And so a lot of our slaves were trying to escape in those years to the British islands. Oftentimes, they were escaping to the Spanish islands because the Spanish were allowed to be free. The French islands had been granted emancipation of slavery, but after Napoleon came in, they reinstituted the institution of slavery. So the French islands were later in actually recognizing slavery. But this was the time of the unrest, and this was the time that slaves were beginning to find out that they had power and that they needed to exercise their power for their own rights.
The early 19th century marked a turning point for Sint Eustatius. While resistance and rebellion were spreading across the region, the island itself was undergoing dramatic changes. No longer the thriving trading hub of the previous century, Statia faced economic decline, shifting political control, and the departure of key merchant groups. What did this mean for those who remained? How did these changes impact the enslaved, free people of color, and the landowners who had once shaped the island's economy? Mrs. Soutekouw helps us understand the shifting landscape of this era and what it means for Statia's future.
I know that there were a lot of involvement with women who owned property here, and that property was often sold during that period. You have to remember After 1816, in the early 1800s and 1860, we regained our independence from England and France and became Dutch again to stay Dutch forever. Our economy was going down. Our warehouses were closed. The French had closed the warehouses and the English kept them closed during that period of time. So that by 1816, after the war in 1812 in the United States, Statia was never more a large trading colony. Small amounts of trade may be going on, but we were not needed by the New World at that point in time. So almost all the stuff that was going out here was agricultural. So we were growing crops. We started growing indigo about that time. We started doing the sisal crop where we were making the rope and everything else. There also was the beginning of our cotton crops. Originally, we were growing Sea Island cotton and also inferior grades. We lost that contract to Montserrat, supposedly because our good cotton was spiked with some bad cotton, and it did not meet the quality that was needed in England. But this was a period that Statia was greatly decreased economically in its value. It was also a period when people, planters and plantation owners, began to leave the island. The Jewish population had already gone. So there were not the Jewish merchant ships that had been here before that were involved in the trade. So because the Jewish population basically left the island by the early 1800s. Only one Jewish woman was left, and she died in 1846. And she wasn't even buried on this island. She was either buried with her family in St. Martin or Nevis or one of the surrounding islands. So that 1800s to the 1850s was the beginning of the decline of St. Eustatius.
As the 19th century progressed, St. Eustatia was no longer the bustling trading hub it once was. The warehouses were closed. The Jewish merchant community had left, and the island's economy became increasingly reliant on agriculture. While global powers debated abolition, the island's trajectory seemed to shift away from its past dominance. Yet, even as Statia's formal role in the transatlantic enslaved economy declined, the illegal trade in enslaved people continued. As Mr. Richardson, the island's heritage inspector, explains, how colonial powers may have abolished the transatlantic enslaved trade, but that didn't mean that the practice had truly ended. Instead, the demand for forced labor fueled underground networks, exposing the stark contradictions between abolitionist policies and economic realities.
So we're now in the beginning of the 19th century, and St. Eustatius is showing the Caribbean that St. again is different. So now think about what I've said about the island changing hands, 22 times in the space of 150 years. We're still within that 150 years. We're nearing the end of the final change of hands, but we're not there yet. In that period, though, before we go in, it's the late 1790s. Two young Irish boys, no older than 25, or on a ship. And guess what they're doing? They're trying to sell a few enslaved people still. And think about it this way. The British have already outlawed the trade between Africa. So that has stopped. It's illegal. But then these two Irish gentlemen, who's then part of, they're considered British, they are sailing down from the USA and they go into port. And in the letters, you can read the letters today and you can hear them saying that, they've been turned away in this port and that port, and they're heading down now from the area of the Bahamas. It's all British and they don't know where to go. And they meet up with other traders somewhere in the area of what is now today the Turks and Caicos Islands. And what do? They are told that they can get rid of their commodity on St. Eustatius. And they did. So this ship comes into St. Eustatius still with about 10 or 20 enslaved people. And we're talking about the late 1790s. So think of it. We're no longer in 1640. We're now in the 1790s. And it's still being done. It's still being done illegally. And Statia is harboring all of that. Statia is still, after the plundering of Rodney that we spoke about in previous episodes, Statia is still doing this. It's still being accepted. That goes to show you what the vibe of the island was. And then you see that it's these two boys, these young gentlemen, they succeed in this, and then they disappear and they're never seen again. And then you see that fast forward in 1798, we're almost in the 19th century, and they still do it. Someone else does it, this time the French. And what you need to remember is what's interesting is the French Revolution already happened. So you have equality, fraternity, and what's the other one? I forgot. Anyway, so the French has this thing, and the French is like, abolishing slavery, etc. And before Napoleon reinstates it years after. But what's interesting is that the island is French when that happens. And it's not Dutch, it's not English. And what you will see that in between from the 1600s up to now, everyone, the island is changing hands, and no one up to now abolishes slavery. So whether it was illegal to even trade or sell in the French territories, when the minute the French got into Statia, they ramped up the trade in slaves. The minute the British, the Dutch, the minute everyone got it back, this little island, they kept doing it and doing it and doing it. And so that shows you the depth of how far St. Eustatius was already known in the trade of the enslaved people.
The persistence of the illegal slave trade on St. Eustatius underscores the island's deep entanglement in human exploitation, even as abolishment gained ground elsewhere. But as the 19th century progressed, the island's economy adapted. Plantations expanded, bringing new crops but also new horrors. The enslaved endured extreme brutalities, punishments designed not only to enforce control but to strip them from their humanity. These practices, passed down through oral histories, reveal the full extent of the violence used to maintain the system. Despite this cruelty, survival and resistance took many forms. As Mr. Richardson continues, he brings us into the heart of these oral histories, stories that bear witness to the suffering but also the resilience. This next segment contains descriptions of extreme physical punishment. If you prefer to skip this content, you may fast forward the next 3 minutes.
So Statia life is still pretty much the same, but then there's a change. The plantations that I told you that were amounted to 30 are now 76. So the plantation economy goes into full drive. You see that it grows even. So it's like one trade dies and the other one picks up. So then now you have indigo, you even have a crawfish, you have sugar, you have rum. There's a lot of rum distilleries on the island from back then. And you see this is then ramping up. And then you see that the island is still kind of disconnected from the colonial government or from The Hague at the time. And then there's, of course, the stories. And a lot of these stories that you see are oral traditions. And I find oral traditions should not be discredited because oral traditions were the local way of keeping stories alive and telling your history. And why I'm going to say this is because many of those oral traditions have proven to be extremely true when it came to St. Eustatius. And when we go into the early 20th century, I will give more explanation as to why. You reach on the famous Golden Rock plantation. There's Mr. Moore Sr. and Mr. Moore Jr. The Moore family sounds very English, but it's actually very Statian. They were born on Statia. Of course, descended from Irish colonists, but they were born on Statia afterwards. And Senior Mr. Moore then is known to have impregnated many of the enslaved women. He was also known as the father of the mulattoes on St. Eustatius. And of course, it kind of, it's not something to be proud of. But Mr. Moore is then, or Mr. Moore Sr. is also credited with his harsh punishment, like his son later, to the enslaved people. And what you see is there's many examples of oral traditions of women being placed in ditches, to where they would be placed face down and would get the harshest of punishments. And one punishment is what I saw was a cattle ride. And I often wondered what was a cattle ride until via a colleague in Barbados who explained to me what a cattle ride is. that is where they would they would dig out a ditch, and it's quite sad, and they would place you face down in that ditch, and they would drive, or the master or the owner of the plantation would ride his carriage over you. So you would have kind of been the function of the road. You would become the road, and you would be face down. And this would have caused many deformities, crooked backs, broken spines. People would have died. People would have been crushed. And that was just one of the few punishments that they had here on St. Eustatius. And if you go back into the records and you read the letter of Zimmerman, who's traveling the islands, you can see that St. Eustatius does not. It's the Golden Rock, but when it comes to the punishment and the treatment of enslaved people, it is harsh. And he records also the quarters of how the enslaved people are treated and how they live. And this is still all the 1800s. And in that period of the 1800s, the island becomes then permanently Dutch. They don't realize it until about 1816. It happened in 1815 officially at the concert in Vienna, but they don't realize it here until 1816.
The plantation economy tightens its grip on St. Eustatius. But resistance took many forms. Some sought freedom through rebellion, while others worked within the system to subvert it from the inside. Among these women were free women of color, figures often overlooked in the history of resistance. As landowners, businesswomen, and guardians of future generations, they challenged the notion that power lay solely in the hands of the colonial rulers. As Mr. Richardson continues, he will introduce us to Frances Covey, Mary Gibbs, and other women who navigated oppression in unexpected ways, using ownership, trade, and skill building to carve out spaces of autonomy.
And as that period progressed, there are a lot of free people of color. The free people of color population recovers again since Rodney. And then you see a lot of key figures popping up. And in that period, what is interesting is that there's a lady called Frances Covey who buys the glass bottle plantation for 3,000 florins or guilders at the time. And she buys the plantation with everything that's attached, including the enslaved people. But it's not all what it seems. And in that period as well, what you see is another lady. Her name was Mary Gibbs. Mary Gibbs is a seamstress. She's a free woman of color. And she takes about 10 to 15 girls under her wing who are still enslaved. But what's interesting is that you see all of these women and also men, but mostly the women having people under the wing, where it seems as if the enslaved people or the free people of color on St. Eustatius or have slaves themselves. But you don't have a plantation, but you own slaves. So the European idea would be, black people had slaves as well in the Caribbean. But is that true though? That's reading things from a helicopter view. But when you go in between, reading between the lines, and you see, for example, Mary Brown is 70 when she acquires these girls. Quite old for that time, but she is going to eventually die at 72. And in her will, she leaves all of these girls are free. And in 2 years' time, they're all kind of trained to be seamstresses. And what you see eventually in the Emancipation Register, when that would eventually come in 1863, when you go back there, you see what was going on. All of these girls were kind of going into apprenticeship under slavery. So on station, they kind of developed this kind of very intellectual way of what we call defiance or verzet. I think it's not explored enough in the Caribbean how people were using this system that was, unlawfully, implemented or given to them, how they turned this system around to make it work in their favor. So what you see on St. Eustatius is a sort of stille verzet, intellectuele verzet, where they're using the norm of slavery right in front of the colonial governors.
Ownership on paper didn't always mean what it seemed. While colonial records listed free people of color as enslavers, a closer look reveals a completely different story. Some, like Mary Gibbs, took young enslaved women under their care, not to exploit them, but to teach them skills that would one day allow them to live as free women. These were quiet revolutions, hidden in legal documents, yet profoundly impactful. One such woman was Mama Didier. She took this idea even further, creating an entire network of apprenticeships that changed the futures of those under her care.
And then there's another brilliant story of we're around 1808, almost 1810. And one particular lady in the register, in the notarial brief, it's like her name is Mama Didier. And many people are referred to as Mama. And her original initial is V, but the only thing she signed, so she probably was not able to read. So she signed, Mama Didier, but didn't even write her own name. But what's interesting is that she has a mixture now of 20 people in her apprenticeship. Let's say she owns them. It's notarized. They're all enslaved. There's boys and girls. But what happened is her husband is the only blacksmith on the island. And all the boys in Mama Didier's care are trained to become blacksmiths. And all the girls are becoming bakers. And then she dies. And then when you go back to the slave emancipation register, she's already dead. But you find all of these boys and girls, and you can guess what their occupation are. Blacksmith, 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 bakers, 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 bakers. And then you see that formerly enslaved people venture out to other islands already with a occupation and a skill. And that's one of the things I think are extremely unique at the time. And I think under a European lens, they would have easily missed this. And it's very interesting that this is something that the women, or especially the enslaved and the free women of color, were doing on Sindhu Station.
While some resisted through economic strategies, others took a different action. The 1848 uprising of Sint Eustatius was not an isolated act. It was part of a broader Caribbean movement where enslaved and free people alike defied colonial rule. This revolt was led by Thomas Dubois. But as history often shows, men were not the only ones fighting for freedom. Women marched alongside them, risking everything to claim a future that had long been denied. Mr. Richardson takes us into the defining moment, one that would forever alter the course of Sint Eustatius' history.
And of course, much later, around June 12th, 1848, we have that famous uprising here on the island. And it is led by a free man of color. And his name is Thomas Dubois. And he's a free man of color. He's born into freedom. So his parents were free and he was born into freedom here on the island. And eventually he would be, after the emancipation, he would find his way back to St. Eustatius. And many of his descendants are still here today. There's this uprising of the 1848 uprising on the island, the Revolt, as it's called, where Thomas Dubois rides into town and demands his freedom. And on the way, it's getting momentum. And what we do know from the letters of the governor is that mostly women, of course, they joined. And of course, there's a few men, but a lot of women are joining this because that's the driving force. They want their freedom. They go into the governor's residence, which is the Green and White Cove in the middle of town on that square. That's where they go. And the governor at the time is Johannes de Veer. What's interesting is that the De Veer family would have met a revolt in every century. So there was a De Veer in the Demerara uprising. There was a De Veer in the time of Tula. And now we're on St. Eustatius. There's a De Veer here again. There was a De Veer on St. Martin. And these are all colonial governors and colonial families. And that's for a story for itself, how that superstition developed around the De Veer family. But so the governor is Johannes de Veer, and Thomas Dubois is like marching into the square, demanding his freedom. And you can see he's literate. He knows his things. He knows about the other islands. He knows about what happened on St. Martin, etc. You can see he can read everything. He knows, and the governor's like, I cannot give you your freedom at this time. That is, it's not in my power to do so. I think you should go back to your plantations and do your work. And you, Thomas, are a free man of color. So what are you making a fuss about? And he was like, no, I want this from my fellow station men. And then with Thomas, of course, there's the culprits. They're the ones that are named. There is, Valentine, there's Oscar, there's Abraham and Thomas, and I'm forgetting one name because it should be 5 that did the uprising and the leader, making it 6. We know for a fact that there were women present that lost their lives, and there were women that fought. And when you look at many of the uprising also on the other islands in the Caribbean region, it's all being led by women. Often, even on St. Martin with one Titiloke, it's also women. But also on St. Eustatius, there are women leading uprising, but the thing is they're not named. What's interesting is that with the 1848 uprising, these gentlemen would eventually marry local women after emancipation. And now we know their names, but in none of the original records that their families or the women's names were mentioned. And that goes to show you the role at that time of women. So you can imagine that outside of, like I called Francis Coffey, Mama Didier, all of these people that predated them, it's like what they fought for, what they did, or somehow, forgotten and swept under the rug. But what you would eventually see as the turn of the century comes and abolishment would eventually come in 1863 is that you would see the role of women in society becoming more and more dominant, because women are not only the church leaders, but they're also the organizers. They're part of the social structure. They're the hierarchy. They are the ones that keep the household together. And they're the ones that also go to the market, because even some of the earliest pictures of the free color market that we have where the current Wilhelmina Park is, all the women doing everyone doing commerce and trade and selling are women and not men. So you see the men are fishing and doing the planting, but the women are the one dealing with the pocketbook. They're the one dealing with the money. They're the one setting up the commerce and the trade. And you will see that will continue onwards as we get into the 20th century.
Though the names of many women in the uprisings remain completely lost to history, their presence in the struggle for freedom cannot be denied. From St. Eustatia to Haiti, from Suriname to Jamaica, women played crucial roles, not just in open combat, but in intelligent networks, supply chains, and spiritual leadership. Dr. Anishanslin explains on this, showing us why women's contribution to resistance deserve recognition, not just in the Caribbean, but across the world.
Even things where women were never a majority, like military participants. There have always been women who have fought in conflicts and battles and wars and picked up arms. They've never been the majority, unless you want to go back to the myth of the Amazons, but they've never been the majority in any of the societies we're talking about today. But they've always been present in these conflicts. And there have always been a certain amount of women who have fought in these engagements, just like men. And I think recognizing that makes it then possible for us to think maybe it's not so strange that people in the 21st century think it's okay for women to be in the military.
Beyond armed resistance, enslaved women also fought battles over their own bodies. Colonial authorities saw their ability to bear children as a way to sustain slavery, long after the transatlantic trade was abolished. But this was not just about forced reproduction, it was about control. Surveillance over women's fertility intensified, leaving them with little autonomy over their own lives. Historian and teacher Dr. Allain unpacks how this plays across different colonial systems and how enslaved women responded to this oppression, sometimes in ways that defied the very system meant to break them.
So basically, as I mentioned before, slave reproduction was really, really low in the Caribbean. And all of a sudden, slaveholders needed to find a way to reproduce the labor force, right? Because as the slave trade was coming to an end, and eventually as slavery was coming to an end, there was a need to continue the cultivation of sugar and other cash crops, even in the absence of an enslaved labor force. So, conditions on these plantations were horrific, just really some of the most brutal conditions you could possibly imagine human beings living through. And so that's why the, fertility rate was really low. And so all of a sudden we see this sense of kind of panic on the part of many many different people with some sort of stake in slavery over how the population would continue to exist in these colonies. And so this goes back to the idea of amelioration. So one of the kind of key features of amelioration was that it was intended to increase the birth rate. And in fact, it was unsuccessful. It didn't really increase the birth rate, but it was intended to increase the birth rate by encouraging women to have more children. So women who had lots of children were awarded with prizes, were awarded with time off from work, were awarded with extra food and clothing. There was much more of an interest in regulating women's reproduction and fertility. So prior to this point, enslaved women were sort of left to their own devices when it came to birth, breastfeeding. Now, this was in many ways negative because it meant that they obviously were giving birth to children under extremely difficult conditions, but it also meant that they had some degree of privacy from white people and white slaveholders when it came to sort of their intimate lives, giving birth, taking care of infants. This was something that they sort of dealt with themselves, independent of, white people and plantation authorities. So the amelioration period changes this, and we start to see slaveholders, doctors, other people interested in sort of ensuring reproduction become much more involved in sort of overseeing women's fertility and child rearing practices. So this put women under enormous surveillance and also made life very difficult for women who couldn't have children or who didn't have children. There was this immense sense of pressure to bear children because it came with material rewards. And obviously the effects on women who were unable to have lots of children would have been pretty significant.
For many enslaved women, this pressure to reproduce was not just physical, it was psychological and emotional. Those who could bear children were often punished or ostracized, while those who did were rewarded, but only within the confines of servitude. Yet, even in these oppressive conditions, resistance took shape, not always through open rebellion, but in small daily acts of defiance that historians are only now beginning to fully recognize.
And so that's one way in which amelioration definitely impacted the status of women in the British Caribbean. In the context of the Spanish Caribbean, we see a similar kind of focus on enslaved women's bodies. So in the early 1870s, Spain passes something called the Moret Law, which declared that children born to enslaved women would be free, thereby reversing the doctrine of partus sequitur ventrum. In the context of the French Caribbean, interestingly, we don't see this as overtly. And this is something that I actually focus on in my dissertation, and I have an article under revision that talks about this. We don't see this pronounced effort on the part of slaveholders to ensure reproduction through medical means. And I argue in my work that actually the regulation of women's mobility was the primary mechanism by which reproduction was regulated. Side note. It would be interesting for someone who has the linguistic abilities to do this analysis in the context of the Dutch Caribbean, to sort of take a look at slave reproduction there in the period of abolition. Another thing I want to mention here is that during this period, despite what I said previously about women not playing a huge role in armed rebellion, I can think of a few rebellions in the 19th century where women did feature prominently. In Cuba in 1844, there was a major slave conspiracy to enact a rebellion. And as the historian Aisha Finch has shown, women were a part of this conspiracy. And then an example from Martinique. The French government abolished slavery in April of 1848. That was to go into effect 2 months later, in June, but a massive slave uprising in May brought slavery to an end 1 month earlier than planned, and women were pretty active in that uprising.
The struggle for freedom in the Caribbean was not only fought in open revolts. It was fought in whispers between enslaved women passing crucial intelligence. It was folded in spiritual traditions that gave communities strength. And it was folded over the very bodies of the women who bore the next generation. As we conclude this episode, we are constantly reminded that history has often erased the names of women. Yet, their resistance shaped the course of rebellion. From St. Eustatius to Haiti, from Jamaica to Suriname, they found ways to reclaim power, whether through armed uprising, economic sabotage, or quiet defiance. But as the uprisings of the early 19th century paved the way for abolition, what did freedom truly mean? Did emancipation bring justice, or did it simply replace one form of control with another? For those who had endured generations of enslavement, what came next? Could they claim true liberation, or did they find themselves in a world still designed to keep them bound? And if their struggle still echoes in the present, if the systems that oppress them left behind shadows, then what revolutions remain unfinished? And who amongst us is willing to continue the fight?